So without further ado, I'd like to invite Ian Lockwood to come forward.
Well, hi everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Ian Lockwood. I'm a traffic engineer with Toole Design Group, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to cover a lot of material tonight. I'm going to show maybe, I don't know, 10 or 14 case studies and go over a lot of theory. And hopefully by the end we'll have a vocabulary where we can have a really meaningful discussion about a lot of the topics we're talking about. We're talking about a particular highway, but this is going to be part of probably a bigger idea about moving Buffalo forward itself, because there's a lot of highways that could follow suit. We're not sure why the thing works so well, but the city's vision, public input, and the old road go in that end, and a people and business-friendly place comes out this end. And so everything we're talking about is this machine that all the public input, the process, the funding, all this sort of thing. And at the end of the day, what we're hoping to do is take something that's hostile to cities and produce something that's really nice. I used to have a cartoon column, so whenever I can't find a good image for something, I just draw a cartoon. So there's one of them. So I'm from Toole Design Group. We do mostly engineering, but we do landscape architecture and planning and so on. And we write a lot of books. We're writing now it's called the AASHTO Guide for Separated Bike Facilities. And all 50 states will thus use our guide for separated bike facilities. We're writing a federal highway manual on how to accommodate people who are blind or have low sight through public spaces and streets. So we're really, we're engineers and so forth, but we really focus on the vulnerable users of cities. And if we can make cities good for them, it's good for everybody. The USDOT hired us to help out with this thing called Ladders of Opportunity last year, and we went to 4 cities that had highways blasted through, which damaged a lot of the African American communities, and it was mostly an environmental justice sort of exercise on what are the options for ameliorating those highways and correcting what's now being recognized as mistakes in the past, even at the highest of levels. And then we've been hired by Federal Highways to help develop the language of the highway removal. There's a lot of language on how to build highways, maintain highways, fund highways, and justify them, and all this sort of thing. But there's not a lot of language about how to remove them. Go figure. And so our firm's been involved with these sorts of things for a long time, so we've been asked to come up with some language. And so we divided things up to mitigation types and removal types. And there's a variety of different types of removals, and the ones we're talking about, and I'm Scajaquada. Did I do it? I've been working on it all day. But that highway is a redundant section removal type highway. There's highways all around Buffalo, and that happens just to go through. So it's one of it's the second easiest type of highway to remove in the scheme of things. And then we talked about the language of the problems they solve, and we wanted to categorize it so that we could avoid these false equivalencies of caps and other mitigation methods versus the removal. And then when we say removal, we don't mean that nothing will be there. Usually we replace the highway with city-friendly infrastructure of some sort, depending on the context. So the caps and mitigation, they keep the highway and the various highway problems, but they help locally. By removing the highways, you actually start changing some of the forces at play that actually affect the cities in a deeper way, and I'll get into that more in a moment. So just by way of personal introduction, I grew up in Ottawa, Canada, and one of my earliest childhood memories is actually a transportation memory. My father bought my sister and I these, when I was 4 and she was 5, these little green bicycles, and they had a top tube that removed. The exact same bike for my sister and I, but if the top tube was removed, it became a girl's bike, and if it was in place, it was a boy's bike, so I kept mine in place. And my neighbor, who was 12, taught me how to ride my bike, and he took me out on our street, which was about 150 yards long with a bend in it. And his name is Michael, a 12-year-old kid, and he grabs the back of the seat and says, "Okay, just pedal, and I'll run beside you." And so I'm pedaling, and he's running beside me, and I say, "Hey, man, this is really great." And I look, and he's not there anymore, and I think, oh no. And I look back, and he's like 50 yards behind. And I don't know how to steer, and I don't know how to brake. I don't even know how to coast. And I get to the bend, and so I just keep pedaling. And I hit the far curb, and I go flying over the handlebars onto the grass. And that was my first bike ride. And 4 or 5 bike rides later, I really loved riding bike. And so I rode my bike everywhere, to elementary school, middle school. Towards the end of middle school, I lied about my age, and I worked at a carnival for the summer to raise money for my first road bike. And I got my first road bike. And then I could go faster and further. I got into the triathlon scene. I would go camping. I could go all over the city on my bike. I'd visit my brother at his job. I would go to my favorite museum. My whole life revolved around my bicycle. And one summer, I'm riding my bike on an arterial road because I'm going further, and I get hit by an SUV. And I lived, obviously. And then, but he didn't see me. And then, about 8 months later, I'm riding my bike again, and this time it was his fault, but I got hit by a bus. And if you've ever been hit by a bus, it's kind of like getting hit by a bus. So when you get hit by a bus, you're kind of splashed on the side of the bus, and you can feel the cold aluminum on the side of your face and the rivets. And all you can see in every direction is bus above you, beside you. And then, like a crumb off the table, you're flying through the air. And I remember, like it's slow motion, going through the air, and I pass a wooden telephone pole. And I thought, I hope I don't hit that. And it's covered with little finishing nails that people put posters up, like a cactus. And I thought, I hope I don't hit that. And anyway, I landed in a parking lot, rolled to a stop, and my bicycle landed on the steps of a nearby building. And the driver took off. The guy took off and just left me there. And I guess he didn't see me either. Anyway, I lived. And so I kept on riding despite that, and but I realized for the first time in my life that I was vulnerable, and that these folks didn't see me. And then I went to university. I got into engineering and studied transportation. And I'm sitting now. At this point, I'm riding in the Olympic Velodrome in Montreal with my track bike, and so I'm riding my track bike everywhere. And I love that bike, and I didn't have a lock for it, so I took it with me everywhere I went. So if I went to lunch, my bike went to lunch. If I went to class, my bike went to class. So my bike would sit at the back of the classroom, and I'm sitting in the class learning about transportation, and the word bicycle never comes up. The word pedestrian never comes up unless it's because it's taking away signal timing from motorists. And so I felt like the profession didn't see me either, and didn't see my friends. They didn't see my community. They didn't see my father, who would walk to the bus stop every day to take the bus to work. So we weren't talking about me or my community. We weren't talking about anything that I valued, actually. One day, my professor drew this. We had a blackboard back then. He drew this on the blackboard, this diagram, and he said, arterial roads are about throughput, and local roads are about access, and collectors are in between. And I thought to myself, my bike shop's on an arterial, the store's on the arterial, my favorite museum is on arterial, my university's on arterial, Mr. Peernut's shop, the guy who lives up the street, his shop is on an arterial. Everything I go to is on arterial. What do you mean access isn't important? I want to access all those things. And so there's an aerial of my hometown, and if you look at the coloring, the light areas are along the arterials. That's where all the jobs are, that's where all the services are, that's where all the food is. Arterials have a huge access role in my hometown. And here's a aerial of your town. And same thing, you can tell where the arterials are just from the aerial. They're the light areas. Again, where all the jobs and services and so forth are. And so access is really important there. And the same with the energy corridor in Houston or the modern parts of Detroit, same patterns. And so I thought to myself, this model, this way of thinking is just wrong. It didn't make sense to me. And then if you look back at the arterials in American cities historically, they were places of social and economic exchange. That's where the department stores were. That's where the civic buildings were. That's where the theaters were. That's where you would go. That's where the main transit lines were. Access was really important. So I drew my own diagram. And arterials have a lot of access role. They have a mobility or throughput role too, more than local streets. But they have a huge access role. And so we deny access at the expense of all of these services and economy. And then he drew this diagram on the board, and it's a network of streets, and then it's like a target. And he said, traditionally, the value of land was a function of proximity to the center. The closer you are to the center, the more valuable the land, and the further out you get, the less valuable. But then he said, the truth is that value is a function of travel time to the center. So he said, your job as a transportation engineer is to speed up the roads, to spread the value out. So with what's within 5 minutes is now a greater area. That's the theory. Now that's a modernist theory I learned later. And that diagram shaped transportation policy and measures of effectiveness in the United States more than anything else. Our whole setup of our mental model of transportation is based on speeding things up, reducing delays, and this sort of thing. And so you look at this old photograph. This is Broad Street in Richmond, Virginia, and that's the before picture. And this is what it looks like today. And so through modern interventions into the street, they've managed to iron out all of the social and economic exchange. It's the exact same buildings and so forth. So the only thing that changed was the street. And now there's economic issues, social issues, and so forth along that main corridor. There's 2 universities, campuses on that corridor, and it's the capital. It should be a vibrant, great street like it always was, but through wrong-headed design, it became worse. And then my professors used a vocabulary, which I'll get into more in a minute, like capacity. We define capacity as how many cars can cross a line in an hour or a day or some time period. And I thought, the streets have the capacity, we all feel this way, to nurture businesses, to create identity, to be recreational facilities. Streets have the capacity to do all sorts of things. They're public spaces, after all, but not by the terminology used in the profession. And then I read a paper about traffic calming, some weird thing that was going on in Europe at the time. And that resonated with me. That related to people. And so I did my graduate work studying that. And that eventually led me to head up the transportation department in the city of West Palm Beach. And so this is the West Palm story. And so I get to West Palm Beach. I just leave Ottawa, probably the safest, nicest city around. I end up in West Palm Beach. And 80% of our main shopping street was vacant. My predecessors had sped up and one-wayed all of the roads. Anybody with choice had left West Palm Beach and moved out of the city into the suburbs, becoming car dependent and then driving back and expecting us to widen our roads even further and tear down more of our buildings to produce surface parking lots. The city had $7,000 in reserves. Like my children have more than that in reserves. Yeah, we were broke. So the city became very unwalkable, and we had a huge crime issues, drug issues, prostitution issues. HBO did a documentary about drug abuse in the United States, and they filmed it in our downtown, and that's how everybody knew West Palm Beach. And this is where the people went. Wide arterial roads, infrastructure was built to evacuate the city, and people used it to move out of town. And this is what was left behind, these vacant, empty parking lots, boarded up buildings, underutilized land, and not a very pleasant place. No development was going on. And so this is exactly what happened. It did not spread out the value when we sped up our roads. It devalued the core and exported the value of the city out of the city. And so that happened with arterial roads, and it happens even more with highways. So we did a vision. We got everyone together. We came up with a vision of the city. We drew it. And my job was to change the streets to match the vision of the city, this beautiful, vibrant place of exchange. And this is Dixie Highway. It goes from Key West all the way up the East Coast to Maine. And my predecessors had perfected it for moving throughput. It was all about level of service. But it wasn't serving the city well, and the vision was to create this nice place. And all of my training said to perpetuate what my predecessors had done. But my gut was saying, that's not going to cut it. So this was before road diets. This was before arterial traffic calming. This was before complete streets. There was no vocabulary to even describe what I wanted to do. But I thought, okay, I got to do something. There's just too much space being allocated to the car, too much priority put to it, and not as much on the place, the businesses, and the people. So I decided that I was going to narrow the road and raise the intersections. I was told it was impossible by so many people. The fights that we had were incredible. But anyway, it got done. I narrowed the road, raised the intersections, and then people started walking, lo and behold. Now, if you look in the before picture carefully, you'll see weeds growing out of the broken windows of the vacant building. Enough time had passed that soil had built up in the building to support small trees. And once we started calming the arterials, the building got occupied again. Now, at the time, the streets were congested, and the people at the counties had their model and everything, and they said, if you take away lanes, then the already congested place is going to get even more congested. Where's the traffic going to go? And so we went ahead with it anyway, and the congestion didn't get any worse. I suppose they could have been driving down the ocean. I don't know, but the city just got better. So we started doing more of this. So this was a 5-lane state arterial, and we made it into a 2-lane street. 2 elementary schools on the street so that now the kids can walk to school. This was where the term road diet got coined. Dan Burden coined it when he looked at this project. This is a 4-lane commuter route in the north part of town. Now this went through a pretty challenged neighborhood. There was a lot of boarded up homes, vacant properties, domestic violence, this sort of thing. And we were replacing the sewers here, so I thought, okay, why don't we do something cool? And we narrowed it to 2 lanes. We built a linear park through it. And suddenly people started walking. The inline skating club got started. Natural surveillance went up. Crime went down. People with choice started repopulating the neighborhood. New houses got built on the empty lots. Boards came off. And it became a functioning neighborhood again. Kids started walking to school. It was really good news of how the public realm shaped the outcomes. This is our main street. It's a one-way street, of course, to encourage throughput. And we two-wayed it. And it went from 80% to full. We gave some facade grants so people would fix up their buildings. So this is the before picture where it was a vacant building. There's the after. Now there's a waiting list to live there. And so people started coming back into the city and repopulating it. And restaurants opened up at the bottom of these places where prostitutes used to hang out and do their trade. Now they can have a nice lunch at one of the restaurants. And then this is one of the infill developments that came along, and again, the county modeled all of what we were doing and said, hey, you gotta widen these roads. Like, all this development's going on, you've been narrowing them, you're just gonna choke the city to death. And so you can see the project going on there. I'm narrowing the road again because the sidewalks were too small, and I wanted it to be what's now known as complete streets. So just a bit about modeling. Agreed it would help the businesses, civic identity, safety, pedestrians, cyclists, transit users, but that, and they point to the model, that proves that 2 more lanes are needed to provide an acceptable level of service for motorists during the weekday PM peak hour. We empathize, but there's no choice. The model told us that we can't do what we wanted to do, that our vision was impossible. And but we did it, and the model was wrong. We didn't get all the bad traffic stuff, even though we narrowed the road and did all the density. So think about your city's future. Is it based on a vision, or is it based on the model? Now, the model is set up for typically growth in traffic, but cities around the world are following their visions, actually reducing their traffic numbers and making better outcomes and increasing their populations and their economies. So this is a before picture. This is where Crack America was actually filmed. And the only thing you'll recognize in the after picture is that building at the end, and that's what it looks like now. Obviously, there's a lot more trips being generated, and the model said we had to put turn lanes here. I thought, no, that's not a good idea. I'd rather people be able to cross the street safely. So we didn't put the turn lanes in, and it's a great place, very successful. It's one of the buildings we preserved, and so that vacant old church is now a performing arts center, and people come from all over to visit it where they wouldn't go before. So the bunch of lessons that the street designs, the public realm shapes social outcomes, economic outcomes, and migration, whether people leave the city or come back. Transportation planning should be based on vision. Levels of service, which means how well we accommodate motorists. Level of service may be useful for signal timing and things like that, but not for planning. We found that two-way streets, slow streets, are actually better for the city, and most importantly, you get what you buy. If you buy a walkable, beautiful city, you'll get a walkable, beautiful city. If you intellectually buy into these models and buy highways and this sort of thing, you'll get a car-dependent city. I also thought about the basics of cities themselves. Why do cities even exist? And they're to advance exchange. The transportation purpose of cities is actually to minimize transportation, is to bring people together for exchange, for short trips. That's why we don't live all spread out all over the place. That's why we have cities. But my profession was trying to speed things up and increase levels of service for motorists, and which tend to spread cities out, which reduces exchange, which is anti-city. And the cities that did that the most tend to have done the most harm to their cities. Just think about the cities you've gone to yourselves. And then the land use purpose of cities is, of course, to kind of concentrate the components of civic life into the city. And even more so on the downtowns and main streets, they need to be very concentrated for exchange. So what I've been talking about up to now is what we call traditional values, the values of proximity, block structure, connectedness, slower speeds. This is what shapes cities for thousands of years. And what I've learned is that what came along in the 1910s and 30s is what's called modernism, a new way of thinking about of places and cities. And they came up with a new paradigm for transportation, but they came up with lots of other cool things like modern dance and music and so on. That's fine, but the ideas about transportation kind of fell short. This is Corbusier, he's one of the fathers of this whole movement, and his famous quote was, "Cars, cars, fast, fast." Deep stuff, I have to admit, but he was enamored with speed, and so he thought he would kind of separate cars from civic life. And his whole idea was to sort of connect A to B quickly and not worry about the fabric. Don't worry about the fabric. And when you look at the road through the park and through the neighborhoods leading to the park, that's exactly what they did. They didn't care about the fabric. It was all about A to B. And that's done so much harm to so many places and cities. And lots of people got in on it. Frank Lloyd Wright got in it with his broadacre ideas. And Norman Geddes, he did the World's Fair for Futurama in New York, and people went and saw this big model and what they called magic motorways, and got enamored with this whole idea. And the industrialists got in on it. Henry Ford said, "We'll solve the problem of the city by leaving the city," and he knew he'd sell a lot of cars if that happened. So that's why he supported it. And the whole thing was supposed to go to the sort of like Disney Jetsons kind of future where you could scoot around on these little magic motorways. You can visit the Grand Canyon if you want. Go visit the Sphinx in Egypt. Lots of cool stuff. So it turns out that this model, this way of thinking, didn't work out in cities. The theory was there, but it didn't. In real cities, it failed. And so the modernists, though, didn't stop there. They took it to the freeways, and this was one of the original drawings of the interstates by Norman Geddes, and so they were supposed to go between cities, not into cities, but the modernists were really big on connecting A to B, and A was downtown and B would be elsewhere, and so the highways were brought into cities, and that was what Peter Park, one of my buddies in this whole effort, calls the great failed American experiment, was trying to build highways in cities. And the values that support all this are rewarding long trips, it's the automobile focus, congestion is bad, but the most important thing, it's appealing individually. And I'm going to get into that in a minute, why they were able to sell this to policymakers and people in general. So Detroit, after the Second World War, was wealthy, vibrant, great education system, fantastic transit system, has this wonderful traditional grid. They wanted to be the best city in the world. So what did they do? They invested heavily in modernism. Highways, towers in the park, all these sorts of untested ideas. And this is what their network turned into. All chopped up, all the relationships between the neighborhoods and downtown were severed, creating new relationships to the burbs and exurbs. And this is what it looks like. It devastated the city. 1.8 million people lived there when there were no highways, and now there's lots of highways. There's 600,000 people living there. And the neighborhood's devalued. So this is our project to remove I-375. There's the highway today. And what we proposed was a connected network of streets to recreate the relationships that were lost. And so this project's moving forward. You may have read about it recently. This was about 8 years ago where we did the first diagram. Now, interestingly, Detroit's coming back to life, and everything that's bringing people and investment back to the city aligns with traditional values, whether it's the trolley line on Woodward or the parks on the water, the cool alleys and street projects, the art. They're all designed around traditional values. What harmed the city was the application of modernist values, and what's correcting the city are the traditional values. Now, this is your population. So your population peaked between 1930 and 1950. There was 575,000 people living here before there was a single highway. And starting in the 60s, the highways were built, and the population declined to less than half of what it was, so 257,000 people. So it's a really question is, what kind of city do you want? Do you want it where there's plenty of people and vibrancy and transit, or is it a highway-based thing where people evacuate all over the place? So it's a really fundamental question of what kind of city you want. So there's the infrastructure. That's part of Buffalo pre-highway. That's the infrastructure that supports 575,000 people. And there's the infrastructure, you can see the highways, that supports under 300,000 people. So you get different outcomes with different infrastructure. So infrastructure has always shaped cities. When rivers and boats were the main transportation system, development would happen around the intersections of rivers and rivers and rivers and oceans. When elevators came up, cities could grow up. When trolley lines and rails came along, cities could develop at their junctions or along the trolley lines. But when the car came along, cities could develop anywhere you could build a road. And so the unfortunate thing that happened was, at that time, the common denominator that linked transportation planning and land use planning was the pedestrian up to that point in history, but then it switched to the car, and all of our metrics all changed to the car, and that became problematic. This is the Parkside Freeway in Milwaukee. This is the project that Peter and Mayor Norquist took down. And it went right through the community, right on what used to be occupied blocks, and created a huge barrier. And they came up with a scheme of a connected network of streets to replace the freeway. We call it a highway removal, but we're replacing it with a network of city-friendly infrastructure. And that was the highest and best use of the waterfront, the parking before when the highway was there. And this is what they wanted. They took the highway out, it's gone, and now they're getting their vision. So investment and people are moving back into town. Do you remember that AT&T commercial with the adult with the little kids? And the adult asks them a tough question like, which is better, fast or slow? And what did all the kids say? Yeah, fast. And then the narrator said, it's not complicated, faster is better. So we all feel that, like it's rational and in my self-interest to want to get to somewhere faster rather than slower. Like we all feel that way. And this is what we call a tragedy of the commons value. And if you recall from your economics classes, the tragedy of the common is this idea where in ancient times, there were all these shepherds, and they would graze their sheep on their own grazing ground, but they would prefer to graze on the common grazing ground because it saves their own grazing grounds for later. But if they all are rational and act in their own self-interest, they will overgraze the common grazing ground and destroy the common resource that helps them all. So it has to be managed such that it helps everybody and doesn't get destroyed. And there's other examples too, like if you were a captain of a fishing boat, you would want to catch as many fish as you could, because then you could feed your family and have more wealth and so forth. But if every person who has a fishing boat fishes as much as they can, we'd have no fish. We would destroy the resource. So again, it has to be managed. Same thing with polluters or foresters. There's lots of examples where public policy needs to be put in place to manage something that's communally important. So it's rational that we all want to go faster rather than slower in our cars. So doesn't it mean that we want a whole stream of cars to go faster rather than slower? Wouldn't that be better? So why don't we speed up the entire city so that people get around faster rather than slower? Because that supports what I think rationally is in my own self-interest. But the cities that do that the most damage their cities tremendously. So this is a tragedy of the commons idea. And whenever you come up with some sort of change, that's rational in your own self-interest, and you magnify it to society, if it hurts, it's bad public policy. If it helps, then it's good public policy. And that's why we have public policy, to help shape those outcomes. So what I'm getting at is some of the value sets that are supporting the types of answers for your highway are tragedy of the common value sets and will harm your city, just like the highways have.